Hi, and welcome back to our reading of The Red Lion by Maria Schepers. We are about to start the second chapter in the second book, The Crucible of Fire, and we've just started following our protagonist into another incarnation. Just met him as a child in Varennes, France, and once again he has a very interesting, to say the least, family history around him, which makes me think about how as we follow him through all these incarnations, we get to see what is the same, the constant in his life, and all the different appearances that keep changing. And I feel like that's exactly what we're dealing with in our own lives, right? So there's this outer manifestation which always is changing and throwing things and hurdles and people and scenes and plot twists at us. And yet if we look back, there's this quiet small voice inside that remains the same. Yesterday, today, and forever. Chapter 20, Monsieur, Bayon. Thus I was left alone in the house in Varennes with a few lazy, impertinent servants. I was 17. Though I bore my father's high-sounding name, his family wouldn't have anything to do with me. They would have preferred him to be childless. The town aldermen, on the other hand, were all too solicitous. Bayon, the apothecary, magnanimously agreed to become my guardian and tend my body, soul, and estate until I came of age. I was lucky as far as the estate was concerned because he was downright conceited about his honesty. He was perpetually enchanted with the purity of his own ethics and performed every action on an imaginary stage before an enthralled audience. He immediately decreed we should close down the Pétion house and get rid of the servants, which was perfectly all right with me. I had no pleasant memories of that cheerless barn. But I didn't particularly like moving in with the Bayon. They gave me a room stuffed with sacred pictures and its own prayer stool. The oven smoked in the winter and the windows wouldn't close completely. But I knew I had to be patient and wait for my freedom. By now, I had sufficient experience to appreciate the regular, compliant processes that could ameliorate my strange and irregular fate. I could wait. I had plenty of time. In addition, in the Bayon home, I had the diversion of watching a farce based on the family life of a smug, stupid tyrant. I learned that if a man strives only to be respected and acknowledged, he will lose his natural dignity irretrievably and become the target of petulant ridicule even in his own house. Bayon had an unusually ugly wife who apparently treated him like a little tin god. Their only son, Etienne, appeared to listen in awed attention when Bayon began to sing me his aria of self-adulation. The boy would mumble the prayers with his father and always addressed him as, "My dear father." I winced at such perfection. Even the servants appeared to attend their master with admiring humility. His table was always spotless when he rose as head of the family to bless the bread. In fact, Bayon bombastically blessed everything he touched. His toothless, pointy-chinned wife would nod, then put her hand on his and practically thank him for being alive. Etienne also said, "Thank you, my dear father," like a puppet, and I winced again. Good heavens, what was all this? Then I caught a glimpse of Etienne and couldn't believe I had seen right. What an impertinent, scornful look. I learned later that I had not been mistaken. The entire household was sneering at Bayon behind his back. Even the servants cast aspersions on his physical appearance and manners. Next day, Etienne, who was 2 years my junior, told me that he had caught his father reaching under the housemaid's skirt in the corridor one day. He had snickered in his high-pitched voice and, though they never discussed the matter, his father had ceased to push him around in private. As for Madame, she was so full of bitterness and hurt that the slightest touch brought a full flood of scorn. "Bayon always was a good-for-nothing scoundrel," she assured me. "It was I, Madame Bayon, who brought money, order, and prosperity into this house, and yet only 3 days after our wedding I caught him in the barnyard with a filthy gypsy woman. Imagine my humiliation. He's out all day chasing every skirt in the neighborhood, and then he has the gall to come home and preach morals to me even while he's on the chamber pot. I'd certainly like to know what he tells his confessor. He probably talks about how good he is still. The priest absolves him of all past and future sins just to get rid of him. And as for his business, he's hardly ever at the pharmacy to look after it all. If I didn't take care of it myself, we'd all have starved long ago. He's always visiting somebody gabbing. People have gotten so they run when they see him coming." Thus she exposed the whole truth of her marriage to me with spiteful thoroughness. Once a week, Madame Bayon had all her friends in to an afternoon weaving party. They would consume enormous quantities of Bayon's bread, honey, cake, and milk, while engaged in the hard labor of tearing him apart. They would imitate all his words and gestures brutally. Bayon didn't know about this and didn't want to know. He didn't even catch on to sarcastic remarks made in his presence. He had absolutely no sense of humor. Etienne told me he had called Bayon dear father only ironically since the episode of the kitchen maid, but his father accepted it at face value. He had even once expounded on how much he deserved the endearment. For a long time, I didn't understand why Bayon's family performed their act of being devoted when even the money belonged to his wife. Then I found out. Bayon was capable of frightening violence when they omitted these attentions and thus forced him to look into the chasm of reality. This experience of looking at two sides of human action made me the richer, not from observing the physical and astral planes, which were merely disgusting, but trying to look into the third plane for reason and solution. When I did this, I could find compassion even for a moron like Bayon. One afternoon, Bayon accidentally overheard one of his wife's afternoon parties. He had had to come home because he had forgotten the key to his safe. Had he sent his assistant as usual, he would never have learned the truth, but the two men had just quarreled and Bayon wouldn't ask him. I don't know what Bayon overheard through the bedroom door because I only heard the story afterward, but it isn't hard to guess. They said he suddenly appeared among the gossiping women, pale as death, and began to shove, kick, and beat them. He hit Etienne so hard, one side of his face swelled. But it was Madame Bayon he beat the worst, along with the servants who tried to save her from him. There had been only 3 such outbursts during their married life to date, and each of these had increased Bayon's self-respect and disposed his household to maintain his illusion. He was like a large, fat snake, deaf and blind, that could be angered only from a safe distance. The household was grimly silent after this latest scene, but I saw Madame Bayon looking at her husband with honest tenderness and admiration. Etienne's odd face showed no mockery now, and even the servants were eager and truly humble. Thus Bayon had won his battle, but he didn't realize it. He felt he had lost everything. His outburst had filled him with remorse and shame. He spoke to no one, lost weight, and scurried through the streets like a branded thief. For he had just swallowed the bitterest pill of all. He had lost his role. He really wanted to be a magnificent and virtuous man who could command respect, and he had deceived himself into believing that he had already attained that goal. It was obvious, of course, that his soul had been inoculated with an ideal, and I knew that his future birth's destiny would lead him to it. Someday, after immense suffering, he would be what he idealized. Of course, only the magical emanation of true greatness of soul will win him the respect of others. But by the time he gets it, that will not be his only goal. That was a short chapter 20, and we'll go on to chapter 21. The Ghost of José de Assis. I finally moved to my own house in Paris in 1724. When I had come of age and was financially independent, I liquidated all my assets to Bayon's dismay and cut all ties with Varennes. My mother had died. The last visit I paid her shortly before her death is one of my darkest memories. I had managed to get a visitor's permit to the Salpêtrière, where more than 100 years would pass before Pinel struck the shackles from the unfortunate inmates. The history of psychiatry has a lurid chapter on this period, but I, an eyewitness, can state that the reality was more horrible than any description. Salpêtrière at that time was called the Hospice de la Vieillesse and consisted of about 45 buildings around a high-domed church. The enormous outer grounds were beautiful with trees and symmetrical lawns. But the further in one went, the more their beauty was marred by forbidding tragicomic instruments. There were artificial ponds spanned by tilting bridges that contained pagoda-like cages used to shake patients out of their lethargy. There were rotating chairs where patients were spun to drive disturbing images from their heads, or at least food from their stomachs. There were treadmills and rotating wheels to activate depressed patients, and numerous other ill-made gadgets constructed by perplexed, impotent physicians. The whole place looked like an amusement park or county fair. Inside, the so-called milder patients were crowded into the day halls, which were constantly filled with their screeching and indescribable attacks. The overworked personnel, infected with a general excitement, could not cope with the situation. Indeed, most of them were rough, ignorant women who were willing enough to vent their spite and anger on their charges. This could be done easily enough simply by not intervening as patients assaulted, wounded, or befouled one another. Public sexual outbursts turned the place into an infernal bacchanalia, and the worst of it was that deranged children suffered among them. My mother was in a windowless cell 2 feet square. The air was foul. Her arms were chained to the wall, her feet to the floor, and the long chain ran from her waist to the ceiling. She sat on a bench firmly fastened to the floor, and the pointed end of the infamous mouth pair protruded from her mouth. The officious young doctor who took me in whispered with counterfeit sympathy that her condition had necessitated this regrettable final restriction. I cried out in anger and pain and begged him to let her come home where I could take care of her and at least keep her clean. Criminals were better treated than this poor woman whose only crime was being ill. The prison sanitarium authorities were offended by my request, and my agitated demands and threats served only as oil on their flames. They finally removed me from the building by force. I suffered from the memory of my mother's cell for years. Her outspread arms, sore-infested skin under the tattered clothing, and almost pupil-less eyes haunted my sleep and ruined my appetite. I was relieved when I learned she was dead. It was as though my own fettered and wretched body had been released from that cell. Paris was in smoldering turmoil in 1724. The Sun King, who had only died in 1715, had filled the country with unrest, and the financial blunders and general depravity of Philippe d'Orléans' regency had tried the patience of the people so severely they could not bring themselves to trust the promising start of young Louis XV. By this time, the troubled country was already in the hands of Cardinal Fleury, a man whose policies were peaceful and clever, and who knew how to make useful compromises. Of course, he could not heal the rotten, outmoded system of which he himself was a part. He could only smooth over the surface while the poison fermented at the core and bred a revolution that sought only destruction and had nothing to do with negotiation. Cardinal Fleury merely gained time for the Bourbons, lengthening the sick man's coma and producing the illusion of health with rococo rogue and rice powder. As yet the young king's personality had no definite outlines. His indolence and irresponsible lechery, insensitivity to urgent issues, unfeeling love of comfort, and the hauteur that would make him an absolute monarch were still hidden by the pliancy of youth and the skill of Cardinal Fleury. Hope is immortal until a ruler actually proves himself as a great tyrant as his predecessor. The people will weave glorifying legends around him for their own sake. Never had there been greater hope for a reformer than there was then, and some ascribed this humanitarian role to young Louis XV, hoping that it would be he who would change and equalize the untenable state of society. But the majority watched suspiciously as the same old things continued to happen in court. The rich positions and estates continued to fall to God's chosen ones, regardless of merit or ability. I purchased my strange house with all its furnishings from the heirs of an eccentric Portuguese named José de Assis. It was in one of the small cul-de-sacs of Faubourg Saint-Germain, which have since disappeared without a trace. The red brick building, set behind ivy-covered stone walls, greeted me like a friend at first sight. It is not only the past, but also the future that touches familiar strings in the soul. This would be the setting for the inevitable. In addition to the house, an old servant was included in the purchase price, a prim and eccentric man named Maurice. He belonged with the house just as much as the furniture in the walnut-paneled rooms. Maurice watched me jealously to see if I would move anything from its accustomed place, and if I so much as absent-mindedly replaced a book on the wrong shelf, It was back in its former place the next day. This produced a stubborn and tacit struggle between us, but finally Maurice won. I had long since lost any zeal for the kind of fight which could only be important to an ephemeral human being. After all, I wouldn't try to rearrange a hotel room, for I would know that after a day or a week I would move on. Thus, I acceded gracefully to Maurice and was careful not to disturb the dogma the Assis had planted in him. The Portuguese whom he had served for 30 years had thoroughly indoctrinated him with the idea that he, the Assis, would remain consciously alive after his death, and that he would return and give a message to Maurice. Of course, the old servant wouldn't talk about this. He was the soul of loyalty and discretion. In going through the library, I managed to get some idea of my predecessor's character from the notes he had scrawled in the margins of his books. The library itself was interesting, full of works on theology and the occult. There was also a collection of erotica, and I was surprised to see a large number of volumes on the Inquisition. Sentius Fra Giorgio da Casale, written about the Inquisition of Pope Julius II, was thickly underscored almost throughout and dotted with exclamation points and question marks. In some places, words had been feverishly crowded next to the texts, fragments of a flood of thought. With a little intuition and imagination, these could be pieced together to reveal the inner workings of an original and distorted mind. There was a portrait of Casale by an unknown artist on the frontispiece. It showed a pale, hollow-faced old man with heavy eyelids and a wicked mouth. The Assis had scrawled under it, "Yes, that's him all right. That's the way he used to look at me in the mirror. I remember that, and I will remember even more when I've pried the gate open completely." Further on, he had annotated a passage on Casale's youth. "That's not true. How little people understand of others' actions. Giorgio did what he did because he was afraid not to. He was really a coward. It was fear that made him cruel. My Lord and God, spring trees in Verona, a woman passing on the yellow road between the rows of blue trees. She wears velvet, and her breasts swell from the deep neckline of her dress. Giorgio, Giorgio, the music of her voice cuts his loins like a knife, and yet he is a grotesque, pimply adolescent, and wild images flock between the lines of his prayers. That image is sharp and clear. The large red stone slates in the monastery corridor, and the suffering, begrimed face of the crucified Christ on the cell wall. Yes, I remember for certain." End quote. Obviously, the Assis was fighting for those memories that flashed through everyone's awareness in the odd millisecond. He was systematically besieging the forbidden gate within him that shut out the past. Perhaps the especially strong recollections came to him, or perhaps these were the discoveries of the solitary pensive man. Since these things exist in and around us, we have only to concentrate on them without distractions. We have only to ask. They will answer. I found wavy lines of writing all over one of the pictures in a book of primitive erotica. It was a drawing of a shapely temptress posing in front of a mirror. Quote, "The flesh of evil women is cold and smells like frost-bitten wild strawberries. They came only in my dreams, but they robbed me of my virility. Smooth-skinned succubi, beautiful and horrible, I remember them." And on the last page of an ivory-bound parchment Old Testament, I found a note written in mirror writing. "Maurice will wait for me. He will receive a sign when I am ready. He was in Verona then too." The first person I met in Paris was Dr. Pelloc, whom I called in over Maurice's protests to tend his respiratory problems. Pelloc was a slovenly man of medium build who apparently was not conscious of the threadbare appearance of his blue velvet coat, the fact that his shirt looked like a used menu card, or that there were holes in his socks. He brought a fresh, friendly atmosphere wherever his bustling figure chanced to go. His hands were chapped from constant washing, and he had a habit of rubbing them together with such eager determination that the patient automatically felt he could conquer any ailment, however serious. Pelloc promptly won Maurice's devotion, not only because the incense he prescribed relieved his breathing, but simply because one had to like Pelloc. He was completely selfless and lived only for the needs and joys of others. Eating and sleeping were simply auxiliary matters, and he only wore a coat in the winter if somebody else thought to put it on him. People sensed that he was that divine servant who bore burdens and listened sympathetically, and they clustered around him with their problems. I wondered how he managed to do all he did. People sent for him day and night, and many could not pay him. His more affluent patients paid him well. I always paid him generously. But the money never stayed in his pocket. He would get it one place and give it away the next if somebody needed it. This rare type of person is always a magic center, for most people are so self-centered they have no room for even a little bit of anybody else's life. To me, he provided the first link to help me understand what my new life was to be. Pelloc's shabby little figure became a part of many human destinies, bringing warmth to the slums, stale middle-class homes, artists' hovels, and the mirror-lined palaces of the nobility. And he was just the same to all of them. In his eyes, the frame was nothing. His concern was the human being who told him about the wounds of his body or soul. He utterly lacked the arrogance of the righteous revolutionary. He had mercy on peasant and nobleman alike. Perhaps it was his total involvement that prevented me from being totally honest with this valuable friend. I wouldn't encumber him with my burden too. How tired he would be when he paused to spend the occasional half hour at my fireplace. His eyes would keep closing in the warmth, but as soon as he snored, he would always start awake and apologize. Then he would resume talking again. Poor Madame Lacroix, you know, the baker's wife I told you about, she started in labor at 7 o'clock yesterday evening, and at dawn I delivered dead twins. How she talked about them. I'll have to find some way to help her bridge the gap until she can get pregnant again. She has so much milk, and there's that empty cradle she embroidered the satin cover for. These times are terrible for women. What do you think, Monsieur de la Tourzel? What if I got her a basket of kittens? Yes, I think that would help a lot. And already he was wide awake with care and compassion for getting his own fatigue. Pelloc was greatly interested in learning about the strange José de Assis, and he would complain of not having enough time to study him. Yet, in spite of everything, he managed to read a good deal at night. His clear mind synthesized everything easily. He had a good overview of alchemy, and he knew how to distinguish the reality from the fraud. He knew the importance of Paracelsus and had used his methods with great success. Once, I asked him if he thought de Assis had already sent his message to Maurice. I didn't dare ask directly, for Maurice didn't know I knew about the matter. No, it hasn't happened yet, Pelloc replied. How do you know? I asked curiously. Maurice told me. This made me feel a trifle miffed, but the feeling quickly passed. After all, I myself was a mass of sinister problems, while Pelloc held the master key that could open even the soul of old, withdrawn Maurice. The old servant pampered him like a mother. He would shuffle in unannounced and set a plate of food before the doctor, then grumble if he didn't clean it. This little bit couldn't find a place in the doctor's stomach because he's not used to eating, but drink that vegetable soup, it's all energy. Who heals the doctor when he gets sick? Of course, Maurice was fond of me too in a dry way and saw to it I had everything I needed, but he worshipped Pelloc. No one could be distant with Pelloc. He evaporated all tensions, and people unmasked their vulnerable souls to him. Once Pelloc pointed out a picture hanging over a glass cabinet, It was a sunny Italian landscape that seemed to have been put in a shady corner intentionally. I had tried to move it to a better place, but the next day it reappeared over the glass cabinet again. What's that a picture of? I can't see it very well, Pelloc said. It is a landscape of Verona, monsieur, Maurice replied. Has it always hung there? I asked casually. No, it used to be on the other side of the room. Then why... I stopped abruptly, for Maurice's mouth had hardened to a closed line. He waited a few moments for me to continue, then left. Alchemy was already declining at the beginning of the 18th century, which was clearly aware of the obscurity, error, greed, and ignorance generally associated with its practice. Men were intoxicated with a new enlightenment and had never even guessed the secret essence of this millennia-old science. They were elated because they had managed to beat to death the first two letters of the ancient word with their new minor discoveries. Modern chemistry had been born, and the elements were rapidly being discovered. Both the Aristotelian concept of earth, water, fire, and air, and the alchemical concept of mercury, sulfur, and salt were being assaulted by the results of experiments. Air and water turned out to be composite bodies with the quantities of their relative elements carefully calculated. Processes of chemical analysis were being refined and made sufficiently reliable for gold and silver to be distinguished from their alloys, thus eliminating both honest mistakes and deliberate frauds. But it wasn't just the progress of science that brought alchemy into disrepute. Many people began researching its historical background in an effort to destroy even the roots of the rotten tree of alchemy. They heaped scorn and disdain on titans like Hermes Trismegistus, Geber, Basilius Valentinus, and Paracelsus. These youngsters were proud of their imaginary victory and really believed they had finally gotten rid of these magical sources of light, when actually they were just blocking the sun from their eyes with their hands. Dr. Pelloc watched this new merciless religion dubiously. The two of us discussed the intellectual revolution at length, as befitted spectators watching the preparations for a bloody play of social and spiritual transformation. I can't criticize their discoveries, Pelloc told me. I've seen these magnificent chemical experiments myself, and I know they're important. I also know that this chemistry will eventually transform the entire world. It's just the priggishness of these youngsters that makes me angry. They're at the beginning of a new science and they act like they're at the end. They think that since they've laid a new foundation for the future, they can destroy the classical masterpieces of the past without even bothering to try to understand them. After all, a healthy present can only come from the past, just as a child can only come from his parents. Chemistry is on the point of committing parricide. Of course, there have always been times when the past has been resolutely buried under the influence of revolutionary ideas. Various physical and spiritual cataclysms have destroyed powerful and highly developed civilizations. Then the survivors and their conquerors invariably fall back into primitive darkness. For instance, Pelloc continued, how much do we know now about the superior astronomical and mathematical knowledge of Chaldea and Egypt, and about their traditions and philosophy that are hidden in those symbolic hieroglyphs? We are attracted by the lucid surface of the Greek intellect, but we are very far from understanding its profundity and the insight of Orpheus, Pythagoras, and the Eleusinian mysteries. The true mission of alchemy is to guard this esoteric tradition, and the artificial obscurity that has been built up around it is simply a smoke screen to guard the sanctuary. You can't blame the adepts for resorting to such measures. There are plenty of examples in history of the deadly perils of bigotry against which they had to protect themselves. the burning of the library at Alexandria and Savonarola's fanatical vandalism are clear examples of the fanaticism, be it religious or scientific, that is the worst enemy of eternally valid traditions. True science and tradition can be opposed only temporarily. The uncompromising scientist who traverses his path honestly simply makes a long detour before arriving at the realization that all roads lead to the mystery of the creative spirit. That's where the traditional initiate starts out. First, science has to reduce matter to a system. Then it has to reduce the system still further until it becomes a spiritual principle. Chemistry has started this process and it has given the properties of matter easily understood names for the first time. True alchemy knew these properties just as well or even better, but it clothed them in figurative language. Chemistry is obtaining its results by experimentation and deals only with effects. He paused. The great analogies of alchemy deal with the causes. You don't have to be an oracle to see that for the next few decades or centuries, chemistry will not heal internal diseases so well as the alchemist Paracelsus did. Despite its important and useful discoveries, Paracelsus paid attention to the whole organism, the structure of body and soul, then eliminated the causes. Our chemists will be merely specialists for some time to come. They'll prescribe medications for individual organs without realizing that what helps one may well poison another. So, you believe in the Doctor Universalis, Pillock? I asked. Absolutely. I believe chemistry and the medical science that depends on it will eventually return to Paracelsus and thus come to respect the old tradition. That's the end of chapter 20, and next time we'll start chapter 21, The Messenger of the Lambs. I recently remembered a little song I learned at summer